Similar. So the book of Hebrews holds a fairly high Christology, probably right after the Gospel of John and Revelation. I'd rank it to be probably the third highest in terms of Christology. Today, however, we'll be focusing on Hebrews chapter 1, which is often used by Trinitarians to prove Jesus' divinity, especially verse 8, where the Father supposedly calls the Son God. The claim is that it's not just Jesus calling the Father God, but Father is also referring to Jesus as God, which they take as the proof of co-equality and co-eternality in essence. The Trinitarian view holds that Jesus is fully divine, equal to the Father, and worthy of the same worship, sharing the same eternal essence. The contextual human Jesus view, which we'll be arguing for today, sees Jesus as God's exalted servant, distinct from and subordinate to God. He's honored for his divine mission, but remains subordinate in both role and essence. Next slide. Our main focus will be on verses 1 to 10, which are the most relevant verses that are brought by Trinitarians in debates anyway. From the Trinitarian's perspective, the key points argued are, number one, the Father is the speaker in all of these verses. Number two, Jesus is identified as the creator. Number three, the Father himself acknowledges Jesus as the co-creator, confirming Jesus' divinity, authority, and role in the Genesis or the literal creation. Next slide. Let's begin by examining the first two verses. In these verses, the author contrasts how God communicated through the prophets in the past and now speaks through his Son. This raises several important questions. Number one, why say God speaks through the Son now if the Son was already speaking before? The Son appears throughout the Old Testament in various forms, such as the angel of the Lord, i.e. in Genesis 18, Exodus 33, Judges 6, and 13. In these instances, the Son interacts directly with key figures, appearing to Abraham in Genesis 18, speaking to Moses, and interacting with judges in Judges 6 and 13. According to the Logos theology, God the Father, being too transcendent to have direct relational attributes with his creation, he uses Son as the means of communication and interaction with his creation. The second point is, why is the Son an appointed heir if he is co-equal with the Father? The term appointed implies a specific role, suggesting dependency and subordination. Even though the Son shares the same divine essence as the Father, his appointment at a point in time raises questions about his subordination in the divine hierarchy. This doesn't diminish his divinity, but still indicates a form of dependency on God the Father. In verse 2, you'll notice two words that are translated differently across various biblical translations. One is aeons, which is often translated as worlds or universes, or universe. But other translations, especially the literal ones, render it as ages. This term doesn't necessarily refer to the physical cosmos. The Greek word cosmos is typically used in the New Testament to refer to the physical universe, as we'll see in the next slide. Another word that raises questions is the Greek word dia. It's often translated as through in reference to the Father creating the world through the Son. However, this word can also be translated in different ways, as we'll explore in the upcoming slides. It can mean on account of, or for the sake of, or because of, suggesting the Son's role is not as co-creator, but rather as one through whom God accomplishes his will. This may refer to a spiritual form of creation as well, specifically the new creation rather than the Genesis or the literal creation. Next slide. In the New Testament, two Greek words, as I pointed out, aeon and cosmos, are used to denote concepts like ages, era, and world, each with distinct meanings. Both words have different implications and are understood within their respective contexts. Aeon refers to an age or an era, often highlighting spiritual or time-based periods. It is used to describe different epochs, like this age and the age to come, as in Matthew 12. Verse 32, or spiritual divisions, such as conform not to this age in Romans 12, verse 2. Cosmos, on the other hand, refers to the world or physical universe, often representing the created world or worldly systems. It is used in contexts like God loving the world in John 16, the infamous verse, or warnings against loving the world's value in the first epistle of John, chapter 2, verse 15. In summary, aeon deals with the time or spiritual eras, while cosmos refers to the physical world or physical universe or human societal structures. Next slide. Now, let's analyze the Greek word dia that we talked about in the previous slide, often translated as through, which can also mean on account of, because of, or for the sake of, according to Strong's lexicon and NAS exhaustive concordance. While many translations use through to suggest that the Son was a co-creator of the world with the Father, another way to understand this is it doesn't imply co-equality. Instead, it could mean the world was created for the sake of or because of the Son's role in God's plan, but not the Son as co-creator. This view emphasizes that the Son is the instrument through which God's plan is carried out, while the Father remains the sole creator. The Son's involvement in creation is part of God's purpose, not as an equal partner in creation. Next slide. So in these two verses, I've highlighted the relevant phrases that may support the Trinitarian theology, so we can tackle those as well. Next slide. So on this slide, you've got the traditional Trinitarian view in the middle, and a possible Unitarian interpretation or alternate interpretation that I'm arguing for on the right side. I won't go through each one of these verses since we've got more key verses to cover, and we may not have enough time. So feel free to pause the video later and read through all of these yourself. Instead, I'll highlight some key verses with similar language used in the New Testament that they use to support Jesus' divinity. And these things are applied for other people as faithful believers and the disciples as well. Next slide. Take Christ being described as the one inheriting God's throne, for instance. Does the New Testament say that he's the only heir to God's throne? Not quite. In Romans chapter 8, verse 17, we see believers or faithful believers are called to be the co-heirs with Christ. The verse says, and I quote, "And if children, then heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him." What about God's glory? Is that something only Jesus shares with the Father? No. In John chapter 17, verse 22, it shows Jesus saying to his disciples, or he's praying basically to God, and he's talking about his disciples, "The glory that you have given me, O Father, I've given to them," i.e. the disciples. Colossians chapter 3, verse 4 says something similar. It extends that glory to all the believers when Christ will return. Now, regarding Jesus sitting on God's throne, is that unique to him? Again, not really. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 21, we see Jesus promises, "The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne." Remember, if he's supposed to be sitting on God's throne, then he's sharing that same throne with these believers. Same idea is presented in Luke chapter 22, where Jesus tells his disciples, "You may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on my thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." And finally, in Philippians chapter 3, believers are told their lowly bodies will be transformed to be like his glorious body. Next slide. Now, will Jesus be the only one superior to angels? That's another thing that they like to highlight in these verses. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 3, the believers or the saints are supposed to judge the angels along with Jesus, which obviously implies that the believers have an authority over the angels since they'll be judging them. How about inheriting an excellent name? Another thing that is mentioned in these verses. According to Revelation chapter 2, verse 17, faithful believers are supposed to receive a white stone with a new name. And lastly, was Jesus the only one given the authority to forgive sins? According to John 20 and Matthew 18, we see the disciples are given that authority to forgive sins as well. Next slide. What about the Old Testament? How many agents of creation do we actually see that are involved in the literal creation? Was there a single creator, or were there multiple agents, as Trinitarians often claim? Let's take a look at some key passages that highlight the biblical perspective on who was active in creation. In Isaiah chapter 44, verse 24, we see God says, "I am the Lord who made all things. Who was with me?" This highlights that no one else was involved in creation, reinforcing Father's exclusive role in creation. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 12, it states, "I made the earth and created man. It was my hands," again in singular, "it was my hands that stretched out the heavens," again showing that creation was solely God's work. Malachi chapter 2, verse 10 asks, "Has not one God created us?" emphasizing the singular role of God as creator. Finally, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 6 affirms, Is not he your father who created you?" showing God's unique role in creation. Next slide. Now, in the New Testament, there is a concept of creation, to be fair, in which Jesus is said to have a role. But this is not referring to the Genesis or the literal creation. Instead, it points to a new spiritual creation tied to redemption, renewal, and the new covenant. We see this concept of a quote-unquote new creation show up repeatedly in the New Testament, especially in the epistles of Paul. We see it in the Synoptic Gospels as well. For example, in the 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, it says, "If anyone is in Christ, he is in a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come." Galatians chapter 6, echoes the same point. Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything but a new creation. Ephesians chapter 4, Paul writes about putting off the old self and putting on the new self, which is created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Colossians chapter 3 talks about this transformation as well. It says, "You have put off old self and put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge after the image of its creator." And finally, in Romans chapter 6, verse 4, Paul ties this to baptism and says, "Just as Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, we too might walk in the newness of life." So clearly, this isn't some fringe concept. It's a major theme in Paul's writings, and it's even echoed in Revelation in several chapters, and in some of Jesus' own teachings as well, as we'll see in the following slides. Next slide. The New Testament contrasts Adam and Jesus, highlighting that just as sin and death entered through Adam, life and resurrection came through Christ. Paul calls Jesus the last Adam, and sometimes he refers to him as the second man as well, marking the beginning of a new humanity, a spiritual creation. This isn't about Genesis creation, but a renewed order where Christ restores what was lost through Adam. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul emphasizes that Jesus, as the last Adam, is the starting point of a redeemed humanity, not tied to the old creation, but to a restored spiritual order. Next slide. One of the most commonly quoted passages to support the idea that Jesus was involved in Genesis creation somehow is Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 to 16, among many others, where it says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities." But if we read the whole context from the beginning, it becomes clear that Paul is referring to a new spiritual creation, not the physical universe. The things created in him, i.e. thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, are spiritual powers and structures within this new order, not stars and planets. This idea is reinforced a few verses later, when Jesus is called by Paul the firstborn from the dead, emphasizing resurrection and new life, not Genesis. And if the Son is truly God in the ultimate sense, then why refer to him as part of the creation to begin with? Nowhere in the scripture is God ever referred to or described as a created being. That alone raises serious theological questions about the Trinitarian interpretation of this particular passage. What about Jesus himself? Did he ever speak about this idea that he was somehow involved in creation along with God the Father? No. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 28, for instance, he mentions that the new world where he and his followers will sit on the thrones and judge, clearly pointing to a renewed order, not the Genesis creation. And please notice, whenever Jesus talks about the original creation, like he did in Mark chapter 10, verse 6, or in Matthew chapter 19, he simply says God made them. Not once does he include himself. Next slide. Now, let's focus on the key sections of this chapter, as these are often highlighted in discussions about Jesus' clear divinity. As you can see, I've highlighted these passages in two different colors to break them down separately. Next slide. We'll begin with verses 8 to 10, because there's something technical going on here that needs our attention first. This detail actually depends on what is said back in verses 5 and 7, or 5 to 7. The claim by the Trinitarians is that the Father is speaking and referring to the Son. And that's where things get interesting. Now, please pay close attention to the red highlighted phrase, "he says," in verses 8 and 10. We'll come back to that later. Next slide. Let's start by analyzing verse 8 in the Greek and the interlinear text that is in front of you guys. As you guys can see, the phrase "he says" does not appear anywhere in the original Greek. Next slide. What about verse 10? The same exact thing. No phrase "he says" can be found in the original Greek. Next slide. So what is their justification for adding this phrase "he says" in verses 8 and 10? The argument goes like this. Since verses 5 to 7 have the Father speaking about the Son, it is assumed that verses 8 to 10 are just a continuation of the same speech. It's still the Father talking about the Son. So it is implied. Next slide. Now, is that claim actually true? Let's go back to verse 5 and take a look at what it says, and more importantly, where it is being quoted from. The verse reads, "For to which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my son, today I have become your father'? Or again, 'I will be his father, and he will be my son'?" The author here is quoting Psalm chapter 2, verse 7, as you guys may have recognized. But if you check the original Psalm, it's not God speaking directly. It is the psalmist relaying that God had decreed. That's why in Psalm itself, many translations add quotation marks or formatting to make it clear when the psalmist is speaking versus when God is being quoted. Next slide. Now, let's look at the next verse. And again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. Now, some claim this is the Father speaking, even though the word Father doesn't appear anywhere in the Greek. It's an interpretive assumption. There are two main suggestions for the source of where it is being quoted from, either from Psalm 97 and Psalm 89, or possibly Moses' final song in Deuteronomy 32 as found in the Septuagint. The Masoretic reading is slightly different. And as we know that the Hebrew author is quoting from the Septuagint, so we'll be focusing on the Septuagint rather than the Masoretic. I've included the Septuagint version here, as you guys can see. Either way, in the case of the Psalms, it is a hymn addressed to God by the psalmist, not God speaking himself. If the quote is from Deuteronomy 32, then it's Moses speaking, not God directly once again. Next slide. Now, someone might argue, well, the author is clearly insisting that the Son be worshipped. All right, fair enough. But let's actually look at the Greek word being used over here. The term is proskuneo, which simply means to bow down or pay homage, like Bathsheba bowing to David in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 16, or Joseph's brothers bowing down to him in Genesis chapter 42. It's an act of respect or honor, not divine worship. If the author meant ritualistic, God-only worship, he should have used the Greek word latreo. You guys can see some examples I've provided for each one of those words and how they're used on the right column. Next slide. Now, let's take a look at verse 7. In speaking of the angels, he says, he makes his angels spirits and his servants flames of fire. This is a quote from Psalm chapter 104, verse 4. Once again, this is a hymn addressed to God, but the speaker isn't God himself. It's a psalmist praising God. How do we know this? It's quite simple. Just read the opening of the psalm. It starts with, bless the Lord, O my soul. Is God the Father now talking about his own soul? Later in the same psalm, it says things like, I will sing to the Lord while I live and bless the Lord, O my soul, again. So ask yourself, does this sound like God the Father singing a hymn to the Son? Does God the Father have a soul? Next slide. Now, someone might ask, well, why does it say in these verses then, why does it say he says in these verses then? Fair question. Let's unpack that. The Greek word used in both the verses is lege. And as you can see from the interlinear, it's a single word, not two separate words like in English, he says. It simply means says. It doesn't actually tell you who is speaking. That's the nature of the Koine Greek. That's a translator's choice, not something directly stated in the Greek text, as you guys can see. Next slide. So the word can be translated or interpreted as he says, she says, or it says, depending on the context. It does not inherently indicate a male speaker speaking. In the table, you can see examples where the word lege is translated in the New Testament as he says, she says, and even it says, like when it's referring to the law or the scriptures. Next slide. So if the translations aren't accurately representing the Hebrew author's intent, what could be a more accurate translation based on context, grammar, and syntax and authorial intent? Some scholars have proposed that in verse 5 and 13, he said in the past makes more sense, since the Greek word used over there is apen, or in verse 13, as you guys can see, it uses iraken, both typically used for direct past speech from God. It could be used interchangeably, by the way. It has the same connotation. Both the words have the same connotations. While in verse 6 and 7, the word lege is used, which fits better as it says, referring to the scripture itself as the speaker, not God. Next slide. Now we get to the key verses. We get to the key verse. Their whole argument is based on this particular verse, as you guys may have heard. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, it clearly says that Jesus is divine somehow, or he's God. That's because, according to them, it's God the Father himself calling him God. The verse says, but of the Son, he says, and remember, in the Greek, the phrase he says isn't actually there, as we saw in the previous slides. The quote goes, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of justice is the scepter of your kingdom. Then verse 9, verse 9 says that he's anointed by God and set above his companions because of his righteousness. This only makes sense if he's a human being exalted by God. just like the Davidic kings, who were also anointed and honored for their faithfulness. This is pulled from Psalm 45, verses 6 to 7, a royal wedding. The psalmist is addressing to a Davidic king, most likely King Solomon, not a conversation where God is speaking to someone else. Also, please pay attention to the footnote that the RSV has attached to verse 8 that I've included in there, which suggests that there is an alternate translation. God is thy throne. We'll unpack this in the next slide, inshallah. Next slide. The literal Greek reads, your throne, God forever and ever. The dashes reflect how Greek often omits helping verbs like is, which English needs. This can be read two ways, according to translators. Your throne, O God, using the vocative, which is like the direct address to the subject, meaning the Son is called God. Or the second option is God is your throne, using the nominative, which means the statement is about the subject, but not directly addressing the subject, meaning God is being described as the throne. So is the Son being called God here, or is God the source of royal authority? Some of you might wonder, why would God be called as an object, as a throne? We'll tackle this next, inshallah. Next slide. Now, how can God be called a throne? In verse 8, if you render it in the nominative case instead of the vocative, which is what the Trinitarians suggest it should be translated as. But we see throughout the Old Testament, authors often uses metaphors for God. He's called a rock, for instance. He's called a fortress. He's called a shield, even a consuming fire. So why not a throne? In Psalm 45:6, calling God the throne simply points to him as the foundation and source of royal authority. I hear a little bit of static from somebody's microphone. I don't know whose that is.
Dean.
Okay.
Yeah, it was Dean. Don't worry.
All right. So next slide. So we're on slide 29, I think. Yeah. What about verse 10? It says, remember, he also says it is, in verse 10, by the way, also remember, as we pointed out in the previous slides, that he says is not found there in the Greek. The verse should read, in the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. And I believe if you guys check in the NIV and KJV, of course, all the biased translations that they have, you will find the phrase he also says. But in RSV, I think they have omitted he also says. Now, the claim is that this is God the Father speaking to the Son. But where is this being quoted from? It's being quoted from Psalm chapter 102, verse 25 from the Septuagint. Instead of just quoting the verse, I've included a few lines from the Psalm to show the context. It becomes clear how absurd it would be to understand or interpret this as God the Father speaking to the Son, especially considering it begins with, hear my prayer, O Lord, do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. The psalmist is speaking about his own suffering, saying, my days have been consumed in smoke. My bones have been scorched. This cannot possibly be God the Father speaking to the Son. It's absurd. Next slide. Now, Psalm 45, as a lot of Christians, they claim that it is about Jesus. Now, let's try to tackle that. Is Psalms 45 really about Jesus? Now, you can read up any standard commentary on Psalm 45, and they will suggest the same thing, that it is a royal wedding song of a Davidic king. Some have suggested that it may be about King Ahab, but certain things don't fit well with his character when compared to how he's depicted or described in the Old Testament. Therefore, the best candidate is said to be a Davidic king like King Solomon. And here are some of the reasons. I also hold the opinion that it is definitely talking about King Solomon. And here are some of the reasons. So first, in verse 2, if we read, it says, you are the most excellent of men, and your lips have been anointed with grace, since God has blessed you forever. Here we clearly see that he's referred to as a human being, not a divine figure. And he's anointed just as King Solomon would have been anointed in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 39, or Saul being anointed by Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 10, or David himself, the father of Solomon, being anointed by God in Psalm chapter 89, verse 20, where God says, I found David, my servant, with my holy oil I have anointed him, etc. The second verse, if you guys look at, would be verse 5. It talks about a king being triumphant, upholding truth, humility, and justice, etc. It depicts this king defeating his enemies and asserting dominance over other nations. Now, this lines up perfectly with Solomon, as he's described in the 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 21 and 24, where it says that Solomon ruled over all kingdoms from Euphrates to the land of Philistines, and to the border of Egypt and serving him, serving i.e. God. No, actually, sorry, it's referring to these kingdoms serving him in all his days with peace and justice. Then verse 6, it says, your throne, O God, which is the one that they love to quote, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom. As we know from 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 23, King Solomon sat on the throne of Yahweh. The verse says, so Solomon sat on the throne of Yahweh, i.e. Lord, as king in the place of his father David. He prospered and all Israel obeyed him. And even if you go to Bible Gateway, and if you scroll over the NIV commentary of this particular verse, it will show you in the footnotes saying here the king is addressed as God's representative. Additionally, if we see in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 to 16, David is promised by God through prophet Nathan that his kingdom will be forever through his offspring. Next slide. Verse 7 says, you love righteousness and hate wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above your companions by anointing you with the oil of joy. The verse shows the king has a God, meaning he's not a divine figure himself. God chose him for loving righteousness and hating wickedness. Just like Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 9 to 12, who asked God for wisdom, for not selfish gain. God was pleased and made him the wisest king ever, also giving him wealth and honor beyond any other. In 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 12, it says, no one was like him, and no one like him would come before and after, clearly showing his unique status. Verse 8 says, all your robes and fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia from palaces adorned with ivory, the music of strings makes you glad. This reference to the ivory palace fits Solomon's wealth and luxurious lifestyle perfectly, as is seen in 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 4 to 29. Next slide. In verse 9, it says, daughters of kings are among your honored women. At your right hand is the royal bride in gold of Ophir. This verse indicates him marrying the daughters of other kings, as according to 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1, he married the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Once again, Jesus wouldn't fit here, as the king is referred to as being married to multiple women from royal families. Now, there are some explanations from Trinitarians, which we can probably discuss towards the end, that they apply this as a typology to the church, etc. But it doesn't really fit. If you read the entire psalm, it doesn't really fit it doesn't line up with Jesus at all. Certain things you can apply to Jesus metaphorically as a typology, but others do not line up. So there you would have to then special plead. Verse 10 says, listen, daughter, and pay careful attention. Forget your people and your father's house. This verse also lines up with Solomon's marriage to the Pharaoh's daughter, as she was also a foreigner and brought by him to the city of David, or could also line up with him marrying women of other nations, as he's said to have married women from all kinds of nations, according to 1 Kings chapter 11. Verse 12 mentions the city of Tyre will come with a gift. People of wealth will seek your favor. 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 to 12 show Solomon had strong ties with Hiram, king of Tyre. Now, Hiram gave him cedar wood and skilled workers to help build the temple and Solomon's palace as well. This could have been a wedding gift or just royal support. But here's the problem. Jesus never received anything. How do you apply this even metaphorically to Jesus? I mean, they could, jump through some hoops and, make this into a typology as well, but it doesn't clearly fit Jesus at all. And lastly, in verses 16 to 17, it says, your sons will take up your, did I get disconnected? Somebody messaged, no, okay, never mind. So verses 16 to 17 says, your son will take the place of your fathers. You will make them princess through the land. I will perpetuate your memory through all generations. Therefore, the nations will praise you forever and ever. Once again, we see that it couldn't be alluding to Jesus, as he had no sons. No one inherited his throne. And he never sat on David's throne, but Solomon had a son who inherited his father's throne after Solomon's death, as we can see in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 42 or 43, I think. Next slide. Now, for those that are interested in digging deeper into these translation challenges, especially in Hebrews, I recommend checking out a book titled Truth in Translation by Jason David Bedan. You can easily find a free PDF version of it online. You can copy a physical book if you prefer, but you can for those that don't want to spend needless money, just download it for free on the internet. So specifically for the issues related to Hebrews 1 and Psalm 45, I suggest reading start from page 98 all the way to 102, where these topics are specifically discussed in detail. Next slide. Like for instance, I've highlighted some of those passages for you that you guys need to pay attention to, right? The same technical details that I talked about, those are mentioned here, especially pertaining to verse 8 in Hebrews chapter 1 and Psalm 45. So, for example, on this page, the author explains how challenging it can be to translate certain Greek passages into English or other languages. He notes that Greek often doesn't require helping verbs, so translators have to supply the implied verb based on context, making accurate translations very, very tricky. Next slide. Now, on these two pages, the author discusses the nominative versus vocative usage that I talked about earlier. On the left side, I don't think I've highlighted anything on there, but you guys can read. There is the mention of the nominative versus vocative. He explains the grammatical distinction, while on the right, where I've highlighted in red, he points out how translations like the KJV, NIV, NASB, etc., they tend to render the phrase in the vocative case without informing the readers of the uncertainty of the translation. The RSV, however, is one of the very few translations. That's why I personally prefer RSV as well. Some people, they prefer ESV, but in the academic circles, RSV, ESV, they both are good. I personally prefer RSV for that reasons. It gives you these footnotes. So it does tell you and does acknowledge in the footnote that there are, it could be rendered differently. Next slide. Here you can see he talks about how God is addressed nowhere in Psalm 45. Also, how three giants of the New Testament scholarship, Westcott, Moffat, and Goodspeed, reached the same conclusion independently, that a more probable translation should be God is your God is your throne. Sorry, yes, God is your throne, not your throne, O God. And I think that would be it for me. Ali, you want to add anything in there, Akhi?